All right, so yesterday, this is where we ended, where we were talking about some of the reasons why the United States has gotten involved in Iran, why there are so many Iranians that ultimately dislike the United States. I'd gone through fairly quickly some of the stuff that had happened in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s as we were going forward, how the countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, how they were really hoping for a Iranian Shah that would be fairly easy to manipulate. And they found that the first Pahlavi Shah, Reza Khan, was not very easily manipulated. And they found that there was a chance that they'd be more easily able to manipulate his son, Mohammad Reza. So you have the US and the United Kingdom helping to put this guy in place, a new Shah in place, with power passing to him in 1941. And in the time period, this is again during World War II. These foreign countries want access to oil, right? So from 1940s into the 1950s, we see Iran's political system develop into three different camps: a pro-Western conservative camp that wanted to keep the Shah in power. We see a pro-Soviet communist camp that was growing in its communist base. And we also see a neutralist national front. And this neutralist national front was really focused on nationalist actions taken by the government, wanted to protect Iranian business, Iranian resources for the Iranian people, and not for foreign entities, not for trade relations that the country was developing. The leader of this neutralist national front became Mohammad Mossadegh. So that's this guy right here, Mohammad Mossadegh. And eventually Mohammad Mossadegh becomes the prime minister of Iran. And one of the big things that he was known for was overseeing the nationalizing of the Iranian oil industry. So that was a big deal. That was supposed to be all for the Iranian people, to make sure that money was staying within Iran to help develop the Iranian economy and the Iranian infrastructure. But this was not good for those foreign countries. So Britain started to plot, how can we overthrow Mossadegh? And we ultimately see Britain and the United States figuring out ways to overthrow Mossadegh. The United States CIA helps, and by August of 1953, this nationalist leader for the Iranians, Mohammad Mossadegh, their prime minister, is now out of power. And eventually this comes to light that it was the United Kingdom and the United States that had really taken part within this endeavor to create that coup and eliminate him from power. This left a lot more power in the hands of the Shah. They did replace the prime minister, but it was not with someone who was going to be taking the strongest stance for Iranian nationalism. So that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of animosity towards Western powers like the United States, like the United Kingdom, because their guy on the inside was eliminated. And it leaves the Shah, Mohammad Reza, in power. And there were a lot of Iranians who felt like he was not making decisions, and he was not leading for them. He was being much more self-interested. He was developing relations with these foreign countries. And all the while he's developing relations with these foreign countries, these Western democracies that are supposed to champion democratic rights, we see him enacting human rights abuses on his own people. Even presidents like Jimmy Carter from the United States, who had advocated for human rights abusers to be taken out of power, even he wasn't willing to truly stand up to the Shah and maintained a friendly relationship with him as other American presidents had. And as the Iranian people are fairly religious, as we talked about yesterday, it was a little disconcerting to many of the more conservative populations within Iran that it was a much more secular government. We see women's rights being promoted. Women are allowed to vote. They were restricting polygamy. Women were allowed to work outside of the home. So these were all characteristics of the Shah's rule that were really disconcerting to that conservative population. And it helps to build support for a revolution coming about. So we have this leading to the revolutionary movement. You have Ruhollah Khomeini becomes a very loud voice for the traditionalists. The traditionalists, those conservatives, were not happy with the Shah and his actions, and they started to riot. Khomeini eventually becomes arrested and he's exiled. He's kicked out of Iran, and he ends up being out of Iran for about 16 years. He first goes to Iraq for many, many years, but then in 1978, he's expelled from Iraq by Saddam Hussein. He goes to Paris, all the while he is in exile, whether it was in Iraq or in France. He continues to write, he continues to publish, he continues to gain greater fame, notoriety. He is becoming a hero of like mythic proportions while he is in exile. So when the Shah is eventually sort of forced out in January of 1979, and you have Ruhollah Khomeini, the Ayatollah, returning in February of 1979, that was a triumphant return for him. Everyone was excited to see him return. So we ultimately see, before that revolution comes about, while he's still in exile, this last Pahlavi Shah really transforms Iran into a rentier state. So Iran transformed itself into a rent-seeking state. Some people, when we were looking at, like, what do you know about Iran? One of the things they had talked about was that they're highly dependent on oil. And many answers yesterday were about oil, oil, oil. That's why maybe Western powers like the United States would want to get involved and intervene in Iran. So we have this rentier economy that's set up, heavily supported by state expenditures, while the state receives rents from other countries. So the state is bringing in money based off of the natural resources that they are selling, or the territories that they are renting out, that they're sort of leasing to foreign entities for them to extract those natural resources. So they received increasing revenues from exporting oil and leasing oil fields to these foreign countries. The Shah was promoting import substitution policies, similar to what we saw in Mexico, if you remember, with ISI policies in Mexico. You have, by 1979, oil and their associated industries provided 97% of the foreign exchange between Iran and other countries, and was a vast majority of Iran's gross national product. So that's what we're talking about when we see a rentier state. When a country is not diversifying their economic sectors, when they are wholeheartedly going in on one sector and saying, this is the resource that we have an abundance of, this is what we're going to focus on because this is going to give us power. And if you're going to have any resource that will potentially make you powerful, oil is definitely it, following the Industrial Revolution. And oil revenue became so great that government didn't even have to rely on internal taxes to generate income. So even if people were angry with the Shah and they didn't want to comply and pay their taxes, it didn't really matter because there was still so much money that was ultimately coming in. And that's one of the negatives of a rentier state, is that people become unnecessary to the government in a rentier state. The government can continue to operate even though they might not have the compliance of the people. So now we'll continue on. So we ultimately get to this revolution in 1979. The Shah, who had been trying to liberalize Iran's political system, was really pushing to make changes, is being countered by the traditionalists, the very conservative elements. Eventually, we see the Shah leaving Iran in January of 1979. He needs to seek medical treatments because he has cancer. People didn't know that his cancer was terminal. He knew that his cancer was terminal. He knew that when he was leaving, most likely he was never going to be returning to his home country. But the people saw this as a win in the revolution. So this is the first thing I ultimately want to show you, is just this quick Iranian Revolution video that shows some of what was happening at this point.
Fundamentalism took hold with a fury and a force that helped ignite the still impoverished masses in Iran, who felt they had little reason to be grateful to the Shah. The fabulous profits from oil had not filtered down to them. Autumn 1978. Anti-Shah demonstrations had grown to such proportions that the Shah declared martial law in most of Iran's cities. The crowd shouted death to the Shah. Among the despised symbols of their monarch, the marchers raised pictures of the Shah's antagonist, the bearded, fierce-eyed holy man, Ayatollah Khomeini.
The preoccupation in Tehran still seems to be over whether the Shah would leave Iran once a new civilian government is formed.
From his exile in France, Khomeini was the chief fomenter, the mastermind, and eventually the inheritor of Iran's Islamic Revolution. The Shah secluded himself in his palace, surrounded only by friends, courtiers, and officers.
Hello. Hello. Happy New Year.
The Empress took charge, shepherding the photographers outside for pictures. In undergoing this obviously painful meeting with the news media, the Shah seemed to be saying, "Here I am at my palace, and here I will stay."
I fully expect the Shah to maintain power in Iran and for the present problems in Iran to be resolved. The Shah has our support, and he also has our confidence.
On the advice of the United States, he ordered his troops to avoid confrontation. It was advice the Shah would soon regret. By January of 1979, it was clear the Shah could no longer reign.
A tearful Shah of Iran left his country today on a vacation from which he may never return.
President and Mrs. Sadat greeted the royal couple as the Presidential Guard played national anthem.
And for the first time since violent anti-Shah protests began in Iran more than a year ago, there were celebrations in the streets of Tehran.
The Shah's departure made Ayatollah Khomeini, in effect, the new ruler of Iran.
The scene was euphoric as Ayatollah Khomeini emerged from his house. Chaotic, too, as several hundred people descended on the area after learning that the 78-year-old Muslim leader would return to Iran Friday after a 15-year exile. In a speech lasting about 45 minutes, Khomeini congratulated his followers and pleaded for unity. "We have kicked out the Shah," he said, "but the revolution is not over."
There was a triumphant and tumultuous welcome in Tehran today by more than 1 million Iranians for the Ayatollah Khomeini, returning home from 15 years of exile. He demanded that the government resign at once or face arrest, and that foreigners, especially Americans, get out.
For security reasons, the airport has been sealed off to the general public, and Khomeini's first few moments on Iranian soil were subdued. It was the quiet before the storm. The motorcade crowds were the most emotional near the University of Tehran, where scores of pro-Khomeini demonstrators had been wounded or killed by Iranian troops in the past week. It was here that Khomeini's security-conscious aides had to fight their way through a mass of devotion. Each step of the way, Khomeini left behind screaming admirers who tried to run after the entourage or leap aboard the official buses. Others stayed behind and held spontaneous street celebrations.
"Greetings to you, Khomeini," they chanted, surging toward him, desperate to touch the hand or robe of the holy man. or to have something, anything, touched and blessed by him. To touch him, one man said, is to touch the person who speaks to God.
A new and more turbulent era for Iran had begun. The reign of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the man who ruled Iran through 4 decades, came to an end.
So we're seeing a couple of things with that video there. We're seeing this reverence for Ruhollah Khomeini. Remember, that was one of the big differences between Shia and Sunni, is that the Shia will sort of worship, will revere living religious leaders, whereas the Sunni are looking more towards the older texts that were written by older religious leaders that have since passed. But we see this return of Ruhollah Khomeini from his 16 years of exile being met with absolute joy. And I mean, it looks like, you know, images, if you've ever seen of like girls when the Beatles came to the United States and played like the Ed Sullivan Show, where they're like crying and trying to get to the Beatles. It's that kind of reverence we're seeing. Now, there's also an American hostage crisis that takes place. During this time, the United States had allowed the Shah to go and receive treatments in the US for his cancer. People were very upset that they felt like the United States was sort of harboring the Shah. So you have animosities continuing between Iran and the United States, which led to this hostage crisis. The video is probably like it's just under 20 minutes. So if you want to watch it, the link is here for you. But you have this new government being set up. While Ruhollah Khomeini had been in exile, he had created a blueprint for a theocracy. But as we were talking yesterday, we talked about how that theocracy wasn't going to be able to stand on its own. He was going to need to adapt that to incorporate elements of a republican form of government as well. So in 1979, his blueprint for government, for a theocratic government, is adapted, and a new constitution is released. They maintained the parliament, the Majlis, elected by universal suffrage, so everyone had the right to vote. The Shah was going to be replaced by an elected president. So it would be a president elected by the people that would ultimately have the executive power within government. You would have this principle of velayat-e faqih being put in place. This principle, and we'll talk about this further in other slides, this principle is going to be incredibly important. Now, it talks here about this, meaning the guardianship of the jurisprudence. So by guardianship of the jurisprudence, what we're really referencing is that whoever this principle of velayat-e faqih applied to, they were going to be seen as the guardians of the Shia people. So it would be their responsibility to take on the weight of the Shia world on their shoulders and make sure that laws, that rules were in place to provide a good life for the Shia people. And in this instance, the Iranian people. The principle of velayat-e faqih was applied to the 4 major religious positions and institutions. It is not going to be applied to the government. So it's going to be the religious institutions, due to Khomeini's principle of velayat-e faqih, that enables them to have way more power than the government structure will ever have. It's honestly a very undemocratic constitution. It has multiple power centers. You have way more power in the hands of the supreme leader, in the hands of the guardian council, than in any elected positions, because those positions, those institutions are unelected. And that leads us, yep.
Is the guardianship kind of like the guardianship that China had?
It's a sense of that, where you have the Communist Party essentially saying that they're taking on the guardianship of the Chinese population, just as you have Lenin saying the same thing during the revolutionary period and into the 1920s. So we are going to see some similarities between these structures in Iran and in China. And as I had referenced, just as in China, and they say that, hey, we're the guardians of the people, the party is. That makes us more powerful than the government. We're going to see a similar kind of power imbalance between the religious structures and the government in Iran, as the religious institutions are the guardians of the Iranian people. So a good comparison there. So we ultimately see this power struggle amongst the revolutionaries, but Khomeini really is the one that has the upper hand. So the traditionalists really start instituting Islamic law everywhere. And very quickly, we have the Iran-Iraq war coming about in the 1980s. It's 8 years of warfare with at least 500,000 casualties, several $1 billion worth of damages, but no real gains on either side. Does anyone know who wins the Iran-Iraq war? Does Iran or Iraq win?
No one really? I don't know.
Yeah, no one wins. It's a stalemate. So 8 years of warfare, destruction, a generation of men being killed, and yet there's no changes essentially to the borders that exist between Iran and Iraq. Saddam Hussein really initiates this conflict, but Khomeini was like egging him on. So Saddam Hussein initiates this because he wants Iraq to remain the predominant force in the Middle East, but Khomeini wants to be able to show the Iranian people that he's the true leader at this point. So I'm going to show you now this video here. It should be short, so give me a second.
For centuries there had been a number of territorial disputes between Persia and their western neighbour, whether it was the Ottomans or Iraq. In the 20th century, one disputed region was Khuzestan. It was controlled by the Iranians, however it was mainly inhabited by Arabs. Another was the Shatt al-Arab waterway, where the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers meet. It had historically been shared by the two nations, however Iraq had intentions to expand to the East Bank. Fast forward to 1979 and the Islamic Revolution of Iran shook the region. The Ayatollah Khomeini took power and called for Shias in Iraq to rise up against the secular Ba'athist party headed by Saddam Hussein. Meanwhile, Saddam Hussein wished to make Iraq the dominant power in the region. He hoped to take advantage of the volatile situation in Iran to invade, and he also supported Arabs in Khuzestan to revolt against the Iranian. These Arabs in Khuzestan achieved worldwide attention when they attacked the Iranian embassy in London. Finally, a cause for war presented itself in March 1980. There was an attempted assassination on Iraqi's deputy prime minister in southern Iraq. Saddam Hussein blamed the Iranians and invaded in September 1980. There was little international outcry. The new Islamic Iranian government made a lot of enemies. They often criticized the US, and the ongoing hostage crisis in Tehran worsened relations. And they angered the USSR by banning the communist parties in Iran, and the Soviets were already allied with Iraq. Therefore, Iraq would receive a great deal of financial aid and supply of arms from numerous countries, while Iran received comparatively less. Foreign support during this conflict would become much more complicated, i.e. the Iran-Contra affair, and many nations supplied to both countries. However, this is how it generally remained throughout. During the initial invasion, the Iranian army still lacked organization since the revolution, and it was caught off guard. Iraq was then free to capture their border cities. However, Iraq also suffered from poor planning and organization and could not capitalize on their victories. This gave the Iranians time to organize their armies. Their air force gained air superiority, and then, contrary to what Saddam expected, hundreds of thousands volunteered to fight for the new revolutionary government. By 1982, they had regrouped and launched a successful counterattack. The Iranian victories, particularly their recapture of Khorramshahr, shook the Iraqis, and they retreated behind their pre-war borders. Saddam offered war reparations as peace to stop the advancing Iranians. However, they refused and wanted to drive into Iraq and install a Shia government there. The Iranians assaulted Basra in the summer of '82, hoping to cut off Iraq's access to the sea. However, the Iraqis, with the help of chemical weapons, were able to fend them off. Iran then spread its forces along the border and attempted to invade the whole country in one fell swoop. However, their human wave attacks could not fight through Iraq's entrenched positions. These assaults would continue unsuccessfully for the rest of the war. Iraq then changed its tactics. They started to bomb Iranian cities, notably Tehran, with the hope of crushing their morale. However, it often had the opposite effect. So the Iranians aligned themselves with the Kurds in Iraq, who rebelled against Saddam. However, after years of guerrilla warfare, the Iraqis dropped chemical and biological weapons on their villages, and the uprising subsequently finished. In 1984, in this new war of attrition, Iraq started bombing Iran's oil tankers in the hope of crippling their economy. Iran responded by using their superior navy to close the Straits of Hormuz to Kuwaiti ships who were supplying the Iraqis. However, after a couple years, this blockade brought the superpowers into the war. In 1987, desperate to maintain the supply of oil from the region, several nations sent fleets to protect the oil tankers. It then became very apparent that the world was not going to allow the Iranians to win the war. Nevertheless, the Iranians continued to refuse the UN's peace proposals. That is until 1988. The Iraqis were able to acquire a large amount of military equipment and launched a counterattack of their own. They hoped to quickly take Khuzestan, but once again, like every assault of this war, it ended in failure. Both sides, tired of war and under international pressure, accepted the UN's calls for a ceasefire and returned to the pre-war borders. Hundreds of thousands of people died in what proved to be a very long and very costly stalemate, but both sides claimed victories. However, they were both left with a great deal of debt, and Iraq's poor economy was one of the causes of leading Saddam to invade Kuwait a couple years later.
So you have years of war that ultimately led to a stalemate, basically no change in borders, so very devastating for that population. Again, in these early years, amidst this war with Iraq, you also have the new government under the leadership of the new supreme leader, Ruhollah Khomeini, instituting a cultural revolution. So another comparison that we can make to China under Mao Zedong with the cultural revolution that he initiated there as well. So this was a period following the revolution where the academia of Iran was purged of Western and non-Islamic influences to try to bring it in line with Shia Islam. So it wanted to make sure that the only major influence was going to be Islam, and that other influences were purged from their society. So for several years, you have universities closed. After they reopened, they banned a lot of books. Many students and lecturers were purged from schools if they were deemed to be too Western focused. Did not come without conflict, though. Obviously, they're interrupting the freedom, education, the professional livelihood of many. So at this point during this cultural revolution, when you have educated populations who are either losing their opportunities as the students were, or they are losing their jobs as these professors were, there's going to be a lot of animosity building towards this new government. So it struck a major blow to Iran's cultural and intellectual life, and their achievements contributed to the emigration of many Iranians, many teachers, many technocrats out of Iran. And the loss of job skills and capitals has weakened Iran's economy. So we have these new organizations. You have a theocracy that maintains some concessions towards democracy. You have a constitution written by an assembly of religious experts, so one of the religious institutions. And so we're going to see, obviously, religious principles being heavily included within this constitution. They talk about how all laws have to conform to divine principles. You have all of these things being mentioned in the Constitution: God, divine justice, the Quran, the resurrection, the Prophet Muhammad, the 12 Imams, the eventual return of the hidden Imam, the Mahdi, and then Khomeini's doctrine of juris guardianship, that velayat-e faqih, that's going to be applied to the religious institutions and say that they're the guardians. So here is a breakdown of this sort of convoluted structure, but realize the elected institutions are really overseen by these unelected institutions. So the supreme leader has supreme power. Guardian Council has a tremendous amount of power. The Expediency Council and the Assembly of Religious Experts. The only three that are elected by the people are the president, the parliament, and the Assembly of Experts. So it's those religious institutions that have way more authority. And then here are just some of the leaders, the head of state, the Shah, until the supreme leader, Ruhollah Khomeini. You have prime ministers that had existed, but then again in 1989, that position is abolished, just as I had mentioned yesterday. You've got different presidents in here, and then following Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who was president until 2013, you have their current president, Hassan Rouhani. So that leads us up to current days, because the current supreme leader is only their second supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. And that is that.